You're meditating wrong, and I know this because you probably feel something strange after each session, an unease that shouldn't be there, a nagging sense that something important has been ignored. I know how you feel. You follow all the protocols, 10 minutes in the morning, guided apps, scientifically proven breathing techniques, Andrew Huberman on your playlist, Sam Harris whispering in your ear, and still, something is missing. But what I'm about to reveal will sound like heresy to every modern wellness guru. Carl Jung, the man who mapped the human unconscious, discovered nearly a century ago that meditation can be an escape, a sophisticated escape, but an escape nonetheless. And before you think I'm attacking neuroscience, let me tell you a story that will completely change how you view this ancient practice. Zurich, 1913. Jung has just definitively broken with Freud. He's experiencing a devastating existential crisis, apocalyptic nightmares, disturbing visions. The man who helped define modern psychology is literally going insane. And you know what he did? He didn't meditate to calm down. He didn't take deep breaths to regulate his nervous system. He did the opposite. He dove headfirst into the chaos. Jung began a radical experiment he called confrontation with the unconscious. Instead of meditating to find peace, he meditated to find war, internal war, a dialogue with parts of himself he didn't even know existed. Now pause for a second. Imagine if I told you that this method not only cured Jung's crisis, but also became the foundation of all modern Jungian therapy. And imagine if I told you there's a scientific reason why it works better than any meditation app. Have you noticed how after a perfect session of mindfulness, you feel empty, calm, yes, but also a little disconnected, like you've put your personality on silent mode? That's no accident. Modern meditation, especially the kind that's trending on social media, has been optimized for one thing: quieting the mind, reducing neural activity, lowering cortisol, increasing GABA. And it works for a few hours until real life knocks on your door again. Jung realized something neuroscience is only beginning to understand now. The problem isn't having a restless mind. The problem is not knowing why it's restless. The problem is treating symptoms instead of causes. Let me explain the fundamental difference. When Huberman teaches you meditation, he's teaching you to regulate, to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, to reduce inflammation, to optimize brain waves. It's meditation as reverse-engineered brain optimization. When Jung developed his technique, he was teaching you to dialogue, not with your brain, but with your unconscious, with parts of you that have important things to say. Imagine the difference between taking a painkiller for a headache and discovering you need glasses. Both work, but only one solves the real problem. The Jungian technique I want to teach you today is called active imagination. And before you think it's something esoteric or new age, let me show you how brutally practical it is. Do you know that voice in your head that criticizes everything you do? That constant internal monologue that sabotages you? Traditional meditation teaches you to ignore that voice. Active imagination teaches you to talk to it. And here's the plot twist: no one tells you. That voice isn't you. It's an autonomous complex in your psyche, a fragment of your personality that has developed its own life. Jung called it a complex. Freud called it repression. Modern neuroscience calls it a default mode network. But the name doesn't matter. What matters is that these inner voices have their own agenda, and they're not going away just because you took 10 deep breaths. Now, before I show you exactly how to practice active imagination, I need to tell you why Jung was right, and why this changed not only his life, but the lives of millions since. When Jung started dialoguing with his inner complexes instead of trying to silence them, something extraordinary happened. They stopped working against him and started working with him. Think about the last time you sabotaged yourself. It might have been procrastination. It might have been self-sabotage in relationships. It might have been fear of making an important decision. You probably tried to discipline yourself or think positive or meditate to find clarity. And it worked. Temporarily, Jung discovered that these problematic parts of ourselves are not enemies to be defeated. They are misunderstood allies. They have information our conscious mind doesn't have access to. The part that procrastinates. It might be protecting you from destructive perfectionism. The part that sabotages relationships. It might be guarding traumas that need to be processed. The part that's afraid of decisions. It might be seeing real risks you're ignoring because of forced optimism, but to access this information, you can't treat these parts as problems to be solved. You need to treat them as people to be understood. And that's exactly what active imagination does. Now, I know what you're thinking. This seems very abstract. How does this compare to something concrete like Huberman's breathing protocols? Let me give you a real-life example. One of Jung's patients was a businessman who suffered from anxiety attacks whenever he had to speak in public. He'd tried everything. Breathing, techniques, positive visualization, beta blockers. Nothing worked permanently. Jung asked him to do something strange. Instead of trying to calm down before presentations, he should talk to his anxiety, give it a visual form, ask it what it wanted to say. The man imagined his anxiety as a scared 7-year-old boy. And then Jung asked the question that changed everything. Ask the boy what he's afraid of. The answer was surprising. The boy wasn't afraid of speaking poorly. He was afraid of speaking too well, of standing out, of attracting attention, of being different from his father, who was always a simple and humble man. In a single session of active imagination, that man discovered that his anxiety wasn't a neural defect. It was an unconscious conflict of family loyalty. No breathing technique could solve that. But an honest conversation with a part of himself solved it in weeks. And that's the fundamental difference between the modern approach and the Jungian approach. Modern meditation treats you like a machine that needs maintenance. Active imagination treats you like an ecosystem that needs internal dialogue. Modern meditation teaches you control. Active imagination teaches you understanding. Modern meditation promises peace. Active imagination promises wholeness. But here's what no one tells you about Jungian methods. They're not harder than traditional meditation. In fact, for many people, they're more natural, because deep down, you already talk to inner voices all the time. Jung simply systematized the process and made it therapeutic instead of neurotic. The difference is that now, instead of these conversations happening chaotically and self-destructively, they'll happen in a structured and transformative way. Think about how many times a day you catch yourself in internal dialogues. I should have said something different. Why do I always do this? Did they like me? These are all dialogues with complexes, with fragmented parts of your personality. Jung realized that if you're going to talk to them anyway, you might as well do it purposefully. And here's the secret that separates amateurs from masters in active imagination. It's not about fantasizing or creating imaginary characters. It's about giving visual form to psychological patterns that already exist within you. That critical voice. It has an appearance, a tone, a probable age, a story. That anxious part, it lives in a specific place in your body. It has a texture, a temperature, That courageous part that rarely shows up? It's there, waiting to be recognized and strengthened. Jung discovered that when you give concrete form to these abstract aspects of yourself, something magical happens. They stop being mysterious forces that control you and become collaborators you can understand. But there's a catch. And this catch is what separates active imagination from all these modern visualization techniques. Jung insisted that you shouldn't control what appears in these inner conversations. You must be surprised. If you already know what your anxiety will tell you, you're not doing active imagination, you're doing disguised cognitive therapy. If you can predict how the conversation will end, you're still in control. And control is exactly what needs to be suspended for the unconscious to manifest. This is terrifying to the modern mind. We've been trained to always be in control, to have clear goals, to optimize results. But Jung discovered that the most valuable parts of ourselves only appear when we suspend the need to control the process. And here's why this works better than any meditation app. When you meditate to calm down, you're imposing an artificial state on your nervous system. It's like taking medication. It works, but it's temporary. When you practice active imagination, you're collaborating with the natural wisdom of your unconscious. It's like doing physiotherapy. The relief is permanent because the body has learned to heal itself. But let me be brutally honest with you. This technique isn't for everyone. If you want quick and superficial results, stick with Headspace. If you're afraid of discovering things about yourself that might bother you, stick with breathing techniques. If you prefer treating symptoms rather than investigating causes, modern neuromeditation will serve you perfectly. But if you suspect you have inner capabilities that haven't yet been discovered, if you feel you're living a diminished version of who you could be, if you want to access types of wisdom that don't come from books or podcasts, then active imagination may be exactly what you're looking for without even knowing it. And now that you understand the fundamental philosophical difference between these approaches, it's time for me to show you exactly how to practice this. Because theory is interesting, but transformation happens in practice. And what I'm going to teach you in the next few minutes is a protocol that Jung spent decades developing, tested on thousands of patients, and that you can start using today. But first, I need to ask you a question that will determine how you'll approach this practice. Are you ready to discover parts of yourself that might be uncomfortable to know? Because this question isn't rhetorical. Jung discovered that active imagination only works when you accept that you may not like everything you'll find inside. But here's the irony. The parts of ourselves we avoid the most are exactly the ones that carry the most valuable gifts. So let's start with the basic protocol. And I'll teach you the same way Jung taught his patients 100 years ago. No apps, no timer, no ambient music. First rule of active imagination. Choose a real problem. Not something abstract like, I want to be happier. Something specific that bothers you regularly. It could be procrastination. It could be anger. It could be insecurity in relationships. It could be fear of making important decisions. The only requirement is that it's something that affects you in real life. Because psychological complexes only manifest when there's real emotional energy involved. Second rule, find a place where you can be alone for at least 30 minutes without interruptions. Jung did this in his office in Zurich. You can do it in your living room, your bedroom, even in your parked car. The important thing is that it's a space where you feel safe to seem crazy, because you're going to talk out loud to parts of yourself. Third rule, and this is crucial, suspend judgment. Everything that appears in your imagination is valid. No matter how strange, childish, or unexpected it may be, Jung discovered that the unconscious speaks through symbols, not rational concepts. If your anxiety appears as a three-headed purple monster, don't try to correct it to something more sensible. Now, the step-by-step protocol. Sit comfortably, close your eyes, but don't enter traditional meditative mode. Maintain an alert awareness, as if you're about to have an important conversation. Bring the specific problem to mind. Don't analyze, just feel where it lives in your body. Procrastination, for example, might appear as a weight in your stomach. Anger might be heat in your chest. Insecurity might be a tightness in your throat. Now comes the part that separates this from anything you've ever done before. Ask that feeling, how do you want to appear to me? And then wait, without forcing, without inventing, just observe what image emerges naturally. It could be a person, it could be an animal, it could be an object, it could be something completely abstract. One of Jung's patients saw their depression as a deep, dark well. Another saw their anger as a wounded lion. A woman saw her insecurity as a 5-year-old girl hiding behind a tree. The crucial point is that you don't consciously choose. You let the image appear. And here's where it gets interesting. Once the image stabilizes, you begin a real conversation with it. Not visualization, not positive affirmations, conversation. You speak aloud as if you're talking to a real person in the room. And then you listen to the response. And yes, the response will come. Maybe not immediately, maybe not in the way you expect, but it will come. Jung called this the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to create dialogue between conscious and unconscious parts of ourselves. Let me give you a real-world example of how this works. I met a woman who suffered from social anxiety for years. She'd tried cognitive therapy, medication, breathing techniques. Nothing worked permanently. In her first active imagination session, she saw her anxiety as an 8-year-old boy shivering with cold. When she asked, "What are you afraid of?" the boy replied, "That they'll find out I don't know what I'm doing." Through further conversation, she discovered this boy had first appeared when she was a child, and her parents divorced. He was trying to protect her from further rejection. Instead of fighting her anxiety, she started talking to this boy before social situations, thanking him for his protection, explaining that she was now an adult and could take care of herself. In 6 weeks, her social anxiety had virtually disappeared. Not because it was suppressed, but because it was understood and integrated. That's the difference between treating symptoms and curing causes. But there's a catch to this process I need to warn you about. Sometimes the parts of ourselves that emerge in active imagination don't want to cooperate immediately. They might be angry, hurt, distrustful. Jung found this normal, even healthy. These parts have been ignored or repressed for a long time. Initial resistance is natural. The key is to treat these parts with the same respect you would treat a real person going through difficulties. You wouldn't force a scared child to talk. You'd create safety first. You wouldn't argue with someone who's angry. You'd listen first. Jung used to say, "What you resist persists as what you accept transforms." And this brings us to the more advanced level of active imagination. After you learn to dialogue with individual complexes, you can start facilitating conversations between different parts of yourself. For example, you might ask the anxious part to talk directly to the courageous part, or the critical part to talk to the compassionate part. Jung discovered that when fragmented parts of ourselves begin to communicate with each other, something extraordinary happens. They stop working in conflict and begin working in synergy. And here's an insight that may completely change how you view psychological problems. Most of our suffering doesn't come from having bad emotions. It comes from having parts of ourselves that don't communicate. The part that wants security fighting with the part that wants growth. The part that wants to please fighting with the part that wants authenticity. the part that wants control, fighting with the part that wants spontaneity. When these parts learn to talk, internal conflicts begin to resolve naturally. But let me be clear about something. This process isn't always comfortable. Jung used to warn his patients, neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. Sometimes the complexes you'll be conversing with will show you pains you've preferred to avoid, unprocessed traumas, abandoned dreams, parts of you that were sacrificed to please others. And that's precisely why active imagination works better than superficial wellness techniques. It doesn't promise you'll feel better quickly. It promises you'll feel more whole permanently. And wholeness includes pain. It includes anger. It includes sadness. It includes all the emotions our culture tries to medicate or meditate away. But it also includes capacities you didn't even know you had. Let me tell you a story that will illustrate this perfectly. Jung treated an artist who had completely lost his inspiration. He hadn't been able to create anything for 2 years. He was considering abandoning art altogether. In active imagination, this man encountered a figure who introduced himself as the critic. He was an elderly, stern man dressed in black. The critic said, "Everything you create is mediocre. You have no real talent. You should do something more useful with your life." The artist's first instinct was to argue, to prove the critic wrong, but Jung taught him to do something different. Ask the critic when he appeared in your life. The answer was surprising. The critic had the voice of his high school art teacher, who had publicly humiliated him at 15. But here's what's fascinating. When the artist talked more deeply with this figure, he discovered something unexpected. Beneath the destructive criticism, there was a perfectionist who genuinely cared about the quality of the art, who didn't want the artist to settle for mediocrity. Through several sessions of active imagination, the critic transformed into an internal collaborator. Instead of paralyzing the creative process, he began to refine it. The artist began to create again. But now his art had a depth it didn't have before, because he had integrated a part of himself that had previously only caused suffering. And that is the transformative power of active imagination. It doesn't eliminate problematic parts of ourselves. It transforms them into allies. But there's an aspect of this practice that Jung considered more important than all the others. Active imagination connects you with what he called the transcendent function, the psyche's natural ability to heal and develop. Every time you facilitate a genuine internal conversation, you're strengthening this ability. It's like exercising a muscle. The more you practice, the easier it becomes to access your own inner wisdom. And here's something that will shock you. Jung believed active imagination was more effective than traditional therapy for many problems. Because in therapy, you depend on someone else's interpretation. In active imagination, you directly access your own capacity for insight. Jung said, "He who looks outward dreams. He who looks inward awakens." And awakening in this context means realizing you have internal resources you never imagined you possessed. But there's a dimension of active imagination I haven't yet mentioned. And this may be the most important of all. Jung discovered that when you practice this regularly, you stop feeling like a victim of your own emotions. Because now you know that every negative emotion is actually a part of you trying to communicate something important. Anger might be a part of you defending boundaries that have been violated. Sadness might be a part of you processing losses that need to be mourned. Fear might be a part of you alerting you to real risks that need to be considered. When you learn the language of these emotions through active imagination, you stop fighting against them and start collaborating with them. And that is a paradigm shift completely different from anything you've learned about emotional intelligence or emotional regulation. It's not about controlling emotions. It's about understanding them so deeply that they naturally balance themselves. Jung called this individuation, the process of becoming who you really are instead of who you think you should be. And here, we arrive at the point that completely differentiates the Jungian approach from all modern personal development techniques. Active imagination doesn't promise to transform you into a better version of yourself. It promises to reveal versions of yourself that already exist but are hidden. Courage you didn't know you had, creativity that was blocked by fear of judgment, wisdom that was hidden behind doubts. And perhaps most important of all, a sense of completeness that doesn't depend on external circumstances. Because when you learn to have an internal dialogue, you never truly feel alone again. Now, before I give you the final practical guidelines, I need to give you a warning. Active imagination can be addictive, not in a destructive way, but in an expansive way. Once you discover that you have inner wisdom accessible at any time, it's difficult to go back to relying solely on external advice. Once you learn to transform internal conflicts into collaborations, it's difficult to go back to feeling like a victim of your own feelings. Once you discover parts of yourself that are genuinely fascinating to get to know, it's difficult to go back to finding life boring. Jung used to say that neurosis was suffering that hasn't found its meaning yet. Active imagination is the process of finding meaning in suffering, and when suffering gains meaning, it transforms into wisdom. So here's my challenge for you. For the next 7 days, practice active imagination with a specific problem that bothers you, not with the expectation of solving the problem quickly, but with the curiosity of discovering what this problem is trying to teach you. Give it a visual form. Talk to it. Listen to what it has to say. And see if, at the end of a week, your relationship with this problem has changed. Not necessarily the intensity, maybe the quality. Jung discovered that when psychological problems are truly understood, they often resolve themselves, not because they were eliminated, but because they were integrated. And integration is the exact opposite of what our culture teaches us about psychological problems. Our culture says, get rid of the problem. Jung said, learn from the problem until it transforms into a solution. And perhaps this is the most important difference between meditating like Huberman and meditating like Jung. Huberman teaches you to optimize what you already are. Jung teaches you to discover who you really are. Both approaches have value, but only one connects you with capabilities you didn't even know existed within you. And in the end, perhaps this is the only question that really matters. Do you want to spend your life managing symptoms or discovering possibilities? The choice is yours. It always has been. Jung just gave you a tool to choose more consciously. And that tool is available now. No apps, no complex protocols, no dependence on external gurus. Just you talking to yourself in the way it always should have been. Perhaps true meditation was never about silencing the mind. Perhaps it has always been about teaching different parts of the mind to talk to each other. And maybe, just maybe, when that conversation finally begins, you'll discover that you never needed to be fixed. You just needed to be understood by yourself. Finally.